Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Canon 211 on the Paleocrat Diaries. I am your host. I'm Jake Fowler. And this morning, bright and early, I am joined by Dr. Peter Casarella on faculty at Duke University Divinity School. Dr. Casarella, welcome to the program. And good morning, sir.
Good morning, Jake. Thank you for hosting me.
Absolutely. This is my pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure. How are things on the East Coast?
It's a little hot, but otherwise can't complain.
It was about 100 degrees here yesterday as well. So hopefully, I think we're getting some rain tomorrow, thanks probably in part to the hurricane from last week. So that'll help cool it down. But we're not here to talk about weather. You, sir, you are the author of a very interesting and, if I may say so, difficult article in a new journal put out by Word on Fire. The journal is called The New Ressourcement. I've got a copy. This is not the exact issue, but this is what it looks like. This is the summer issue. Dr. Casarella's article is featured in the spring issue, which is number 1 of volume 1. The title of the article, Romano Guardini and the Question Concerning Technology, immediately perked my ears, so to speak, because I'm a big fan of Guardini and technology. Obviously, this is something that theologians need to grapple with. So let me begin by welcoming you once more. And perhaps could you offer a brief overview of your article and why you wanted to write something like it?
Sure. So the question itself, the so-called question concerning technology, has been on my mind for a long time. It was actually the question that I read about when I was in college, and that I, on that basis, for good or ill, decided to write my senior thesis on Heidegger. And then I left it aside because of a kind of disappointment with the way that Heidegger resolved things in the end, and only came back to it recently at the invitation of the new Ressourcement conference, which was organized by Word on Fire. Having studied Guardini over the years, but deciding to dedicate myself to the contemporary of Heidegger, Romano Guardini, who looks at the question concerning technology, sometimes in the same way as Heidegger, but through a Christian lens. I wanted to highlight here, and then eventually in the book I hope to write on Romano Guardini on technology and liturgy, I wanted to highlight how a Christian perspective could look as deeply as Heidegger did, but get beyond many of the constraints that I had discovered in Heidegger's approach.
So it seems Heidegger has a sort of pessimistic, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you wrote is that he thinks that the question concerning technology is actually bringing about the end of the history of being. And he was a metaphysician, if I recall. So he made being, the study of being, his living. And it seems like, again, if I'm reading this right, that he was very put off by this whole thing. And you contrast that with Guardini's, maybe not, optimism is an okay word, but I don't think Guardini is very excited about all this new technology, but I think he doesn't view it as much of a threat as Heidegger might. Am I on track here?
I think both think of it as a threat, but what the new dimension that you find in Guardini is the hope that comes from the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is systematically excluded, among many other things, in Heidegger's worldview.
So how does Heidegger in general approach this question? Or maybe actually, let's back up. What is the question that they're trying to solve, that they're tackling?
So both are writing in Weimar, Germany, with Hitler's rise to power, and both are having to, in different ways, come to grips with that. Neither of them were particularly successful. Heidegger actually embraces Hitlerism and is rewarded with a post as rector or president of the University of Freiburg, and he ends his presidential address with a Heil Hitler. Heidegger later distances himself from National Socialism, but his diaries show that he was actually more convinced of their anti-Semitism than they were. And that's kind of a new thing that's come out in Heidegger studies. Guardini is exiled by the National Socialists from his position in Berlin, but also I think we could say was a little slow to develop that critique. Anyway, my point was not to talk about the politics, but they're both in that milieu in which militarism and the use of new weapons that can destroy humanity, are literally in front of them. And then also, as Guardini writes about in the 1920s in so-called letters from Lake Como, I mean, what is the change of perspective in the world? I mean, he's worried about steamboats. He's worried about mechanization, the machine. And so what is the worldview that is brought about when we're no longer looking at the world in just a gaze of wonder, and now we're looking at the world as instruments for our fabrication and self-fabrication? So the so-called Homo faber, man, the maker of all things, and literally the one who can create and recreate in a way that was formerly assigned only to the living God, that becomes then the question that has to be interrogated and asked. What is the nature of this technology that the world is embracing for all kinds of different purposes? And what does that teach us about, well, as you said, for Heidegger, the nature of being itself, and then the nature of the human person?
It appears we have a special guest commentator.
I'm delighted.
Yeah, she may have had a nightmare. She came up the stairs quite upset a moment ago. But so that's very enlightening. And so Heidegger and Guardini then, from roughly the same cultural context, approaching these in two different ways. And then it's obvious that the distinction is in Guardini's Catholicism. And I'm assuming Heidegger's an atheist, but I don't know that for sure.
Let me say just a word about that. That's actually that's basically true. Heidegger at one point was very immersed in a Catholic worldview in Bavaria, but leaves it behind early on. His wife was Lutheran. He worked with Bultmann and kind of studied Kierkegaard, new tendencies in Protestant theology, but basically can be looked at as a pagan or post-Christian. There's a little tantalizing bit in a posthumously published piece that comes out in the German magazine Der Spiegel, in which he says only a God can save us, but that doesn't seem to be the God of Christian faith. It just seems to be a God of his own making that could maybe rescue the metaphysics that he saw dead and buried. So Heidegger we can call, for all practical purposes, a pagan or post-Christian, whereas Guardini is going deep into the New Testament encounter with the person of Christ in order to understand the resources we need to look at the world in a new way.
So just as a quick side note before we move on, you have a comment here, page 179, about Heidegger desiring to become a genuine follower of Nietzsche without significant residues of totalitarianism. And I wrote in the margins, is that even possible? Because I'm no expert on Nietzsche, but the way I understand it is that what it boils down to is sheer will to power. And so...
Yeah, that's the point. If you take what Nietzsche says about the will to power, you're also then committed to what he called the Umwerten aller Werten, which is a play on words, meaning the devaluation and revaluation of all values, whereby, as he talks about in Truth and Lie in the extramoral sense, truth itself then becomes a human fabrication. So, and Heidegger says that when he wrote about Nietzsche in the post-war period, he was distancing himself from National Socialism. And meanwhile, the diaries show that he was as rabidly anti-Semitic, if not more so, than the Nazis and all kinds of other racists. I mean, anti-British, anti-everything. The president of the German Heidegger Society resigned when these diaries were published. It was so atrocious. So Heidegger himself seems to have been a totalitarian as bad or worse than the Nazis themselves, even though he claimed that he was developing a kind of more open-ended and value-free Nietzscheanism in the 50s. Guardini saw through all that and opposed to the kind of Nietzschean will to power, the Augustinian view that we look at the world through the mind of Christ.
So then that colors Guardini's approach to this question, which sort of centers around his conception of vision as a theological concept or as a philosophical concept, or both, rather. Can you say a few things about how vision informs Guardini's approach to the question of technology?
Right. Thank you for that question. It gets to the heart of the matter already early on. He's talking about how we look at things when he's traveling. So he was born in Verona, but then grew up in Germany. His father was a businessman and moved to Germany. But then when he returns to Lake Como in Italy, he's kind of reconnecting with the land, with the people, with his own origins. And he's looking at this beautiful landscape in Lake Como and trying to talk about what vision is necessary in order to capture the sense of being that you could have if you were from this land, if you not in the nationalistic sense, but in the sense of understanding the beauty of the God who created it all. So a couple points about vision. He's in line with what St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2:16, that we have to discern our place in the world such that the mind of Christ is our own, so that we're looking, so that he calls it Blick Christi, the glance, the gaze that Christ has in looking at the world, is the one that in which we can participate in order to see the world fresh, anew, and the beauty of the Creator God in all, the one who creates out of nothing in all things. There is 2 or 3 more little points about that. There is a kind of residual Augustinian Platonism. I mean, Augustine himself was interested in vision and sensory perceptions in terms of understanding that as a cipher for the spiritual life. Secondly, Guardini even wrote about film and has a whole book on the senses that I talk about in the article. So he's really trying to look at this question of vision in terms of not disparaging film was a new reality. And the question is, should you even watch films because of this new art form? And he ultimately says yes, but looking at that in terms of the dangers and the new possibilities of this new medium. In the end, what you get from, and there's also a phrase in German, sorry for all this Germanism, but it's hard to translate.
No, this is great.
Lautbarkeit des Blicks. Some of the European scholars have written a lot about this particular phrase. It basically means that when we take on the mind of Christ, the purity of Christ's gaze is motivating us, is guiding us. But that phrase, Lautbarkeit, when he uses it in some of his lectures talking about sacramentality, it also has within it the German adjective loud. So somehow it's a kind of mixed metaphor, because a gaze doesn't speak. But what he's saying is that the Blick, the gaze that Christ has in looking at the world, like the Word of God, whom Christ incarnates, reverberates through history. So the gaze of Christ is a loud, reverberating gaze that finds its echoes in all generations and gives us a guide for understanding the beginning, middle, and end of history. So that's obviously a poetic inversion. How can a gaze speak? But that was one that he drew upon. But in general, what he wants to say is that there's a whole greater than its parts. And in this world that's now embracing the mechanism, fragmentary thinking, we need to go back to some way of a kind of new holism.
Yes, on page 182, as a matter of fact, you point out that, I'll just read it a little bit. It says, these philosophers were seeking to grasp the big picture into which technology fits, including in terms of a new political order. To see this picture, which we have already identified as a consciously paradoxical task, requires a new discipline or formation that yields a new way to look at things, a way to see things as if we're seeing them for the first time. In other words, we have to break out of what I think we can call it an immanent frame, which it's a concept I'm borrowing from Charles Taylor, where a priest told me once, it's hard to see the picture when you're in it. And maybe this is why Guardini wanted to get out of Germany in order to reflect on the questions, so that he could be not in a foreign environment exactly, but somewhere where he wasn't so accustomed to things, where it could strike him as fresh, where he could take this this intellectual concept of the gaze of Christ and actually allow it to sort of immerse himself in it, or be immersed rather by God's grace, and then appropriate and approach the question anew. Do you think that's a part of it?
Oh, that's right. That's spot on. I mean, both Heidegger and Guardini are looking at, the world as secularizing. They didn't use that term. I mean, Heidegger wrote about Nietzsche's word that God is dead, but Guardini is definitely trying to confront what he sees as an incipient secularism. But as he says how do you think beyond that when it's taking over? I mean, that concept of secularism was still brand new. I mean, for better or worse, German society was becoming hyper-Christian, and then the question was, did that lead you to follow or oppose Hitler? I mean, Bonhoeffer and Barth spoke to that question as well. But going back to Guardini, what he wanted to get at was how we have in the Christian vision an eschatological vision in which Christ, from the end of time, as the judge of all time, is coming back to offering us love and mercy within time. And so the relationship between time and eternity is, for Guardini as a Christian, a very real way of thinking about this new secular, what Taylor calls secular age, or imminent frame. But Guardini is also, as he wrote in the middle of the 20th century and the end of the modern world, not just saying, add some Christian magic potion to the world and everything gets better. He's saying that there's the rise with the new concept of freedom, which he sees partly allied with the technological frame, or what he calls the technocratic frame, an unpagan paganism. That is, it's not just a loss of Christian belief, but it's the reformulation of the notion of the human being as a will to power that has no restraints, and that we have to rediscover the meaning of Christian freedom in all of its dimensions, in an Augustinian sense, and also in a wider sense for the public forum, before we can even move forward.
So that explains his emphasis so much on vision. If you need to see with the eyes of your mind, and there was another. Please don't apologize for any German words. I'm trying to learn German myself, and although it's very slow going,
Schön.
Danke. I was struck by, I think it's Wahrgenommen, or Wahrnehmung, that the concept of, you say it's not just not just an impressing of a mark on the tabula rasa of the mind, but a taking in and discovering of what is discovered as true. And so again, it's sort of like you're allowing yourself to be immersed in this new reality, which comes through seeing as a whole, not seeing, as you pointed out earlier, the mechanistic bits, the analyzing and always dissecting and subjecting the natural world and all of reality to like a foreign experiment or something, but rather just letting being soak through you in such a way that you can come away with an appreciation for the whole. And then from that point, you can tackle the question of technology. So that leads me to another question that I wanted to ask you. You mentioned in your article that according to Guardini, and I think according to Heidegger also, we cannot treat this question as if the answer were self-evident. What do you mean by that?
So Heidegger, okay, again, I have to come back to one of the German phrase that Heidegger used was die Frage nach der Technik. The question, just translates the question concerning technology, but that preposition nach has a double meaning, because it can mean the question with regard to technology, or it could mean nach is also after. And Heidegger had made the same move in his introduction to metaphysics, in which he noted that he's basically going to end up heralding later the end of metaphysics. But in that work, he says, what does Aristotle mean by ta meta ta physica? Again, the preposition meta or nach or after, it could mean that there is a kind of mode of thinking, the metaphysical, that kind of looks at the physical, ta physica, from above and beyond as a kind of meta science. And today, so many philosophy departments are saying, oh, philosophy is just the questions that arise in, honing down what the problems are in the scientific method. Well, that excludes the question of being. Heidegger said, actually, in Introduction to Metaphysics, it's the question that remains once you see that you're moving towards a post-metaphysical world. And ta physica, the physical things are standing before you. Likewise, with regard to technology, he will maintain that we're enframed by the technique, the technological, what Guardini calls the technocratic worldview. And we don't really see outside of it because it's so, and this is before internet, digital age, the cell phone. This is, 50, 67 years before these innovations that take place after the beginning of the 21st century, that they're seeing that technology was a kind of sea in which we're swimming. It wasn't just an innocent tool that stands before us that you can release yourself from. And that's where the question, what question do you ask? Because you're not going to be able to extricate from it's not just getting a life vest and getting back on the boat. What question do you ask to see how for Heidegger, the nature of being, and for Guardini, the nature of the human person has been so transformed?
So this concept then, along those lines of seeing and trying to break out of that paradigm, the concept of the Lumen Christi, which is picked up later by Pope Francis in his dissertation, I believe. Can you say a few things about how that is crucial for Christians today when we attempt to come to grips with the technological paradigm, the technocratic paradigm? What is this about the Lumen Christi? So now we've got German and Latin involved. And how does that, or how ought that shape the way we approach this question?
Well, again, thank you. As I said before, there's a kind of Platonic, Augustinian background to thinking about the light that emanates from Christ in Guardini. Also, I was very influenced by the founding at the University of Chicago, the Lumen Christi Institute, and its director, Thomas Levergood, was a dear friend who passed only a couple of years ago. So I can't think about Lumen Christi without thinking about that great initiative that he started there that was so influential upon me and others. But Lumen Christi is not just the instrument that, like, when you flick on the light switch, suddenly you're able to see. Lumen Christi is, again, this gaze of the love of God that's seen through the incarnate eyes of Christ, who took on flesh and offered us mercy for the sake of our salvation, so that we can participate in a vision of God as the world moves forward under Christ's gaze toward its ultimate eschaton, or final reality, which is the unveiling of God himself to all of humanity. So Lumen Christi is a kind of little window for looking at the whole of human history under the gaze of Christ. Now, you mentioned Pope Francis. Pope Francis had gone to Germany as a young man to work on a dissertation on Guardini that didn't get finished, but he, both in The Joy of the Gospel and then even more so in the encyclical Laudato Si, starts citing from Guardini, particularly from his End of the Modern World. And one of the things, it's not directly from Guardini, and I know this because the late philosopher Juan Carlos Canoni, who was a personal friend of Francis, asked him, did you get this from Guardini? And the Pope said no. So we have it on the Pope's authority that this was his own invention, but it seemed inspired by Guardini, the notion of polyhedric thinking. So the Pope says that spheres, Sphere, not spears, but spheres are bad and polyhedra are good. And the difference is that in the sphere, all the points on the circumference or surface of the sphere have an equal relationship to the center. So that's homogenization. That's washing out difference. In a polyhedron, you have multiple sets of relationships between the outermost surface of this multi-sided three-dimensional figure and the center. So that's unity in diversity. So inspired by Guardini, Pope Francis in the Joy of the Gospel, I think it's 222 or something like that, invokes the concept of polyhedric thinking to think about unity with diversity. And that's very interesting. He applies it to the church. He applies it to many different realities in the world around us. And that'll get us beyond this technocratic fragmentation.
So that you're not hemmed in on any particular side by the overarching, you call it an enframing, right? The Gestellen that Heidegger spoke of, that if you take it for granted, if I'm not enframed by technology, next thing you know, you can't think about it in the proper terms. So this polyhedral thinking that's actually quite innovative. I appreciate that. And it seems like then I'm going to try to synthesize and keep in mind I'm not a scholar, so this may be awkward. If we have vision as our fundamental approach, and not only vision, but the gaze of Christ, right? The Lumen Christi, which can only come through the church, properly speaking. So it's an ecclesial reality, and it's one that attempts at grasping the whole. Then we can see all the different ways in which the technocratic paradigm is not only influencing human life, in A, B, and C ways, but in fact influencing the influences and shaping how we receive the influences. If we can get beyond that, which again I think is why Guardini wanted to go to agrarian Italy instead of industrial Germany, to ponder this question, then and only then can we arrive at a healthy understanding, like a healthy opinion of technology, and one that doesn't exclude the eschaton. You mentioned that earlier. There's an eschatological dimension here, whereas Heidegger is pessimistic and thinks that technology, we're all doomed. This is the end, the beginning of the end. Guardini says, well, okay, there's a threat. However, Christians, we know the end of the story. And we can allow that to inform how we will move through this new paradigm. How's that for a synthesis at 5 a.m.? All right. Let's shift gears a little bit. There was a very interesting section in your paper. And if I'm being perfectly honest, it's the one that I understood the least. I think it's section 3, where you discuss Michel Foucault and Giorgio Agamben. How do they fit in to this dynamic? These two fellows are philosophers, I take it. I believe one is French and the other perhaps Italian. And they seem to be trying to use Heidegger's categories to tackle this same question, but they're arriving at a much different end than Guardini.
I think you can. So both Foucault and Agamben, just minimally, you have to concede that they're post-Christian and working more out of the Nietzschean framework than we were talking about earlier, than this Christian worldview that Guardini advocated and passionately defended. So it was a little bit of a speculative leap. I know some of my colleagues and friends said, why did you even include that part? But I want to defend it in this sense, is that both Foucault and then a reader of Foucault, Agamben, saw in this trajectory coming out of Heidegger's this understanding of Gestell or technology as a kind of enframing, that there is a totality to the worldview that we haven't yet fathomed yet. And Agamben is a very complicated argument there, but Agamben writes about the term that Foucault used in French. It's le dispositif, which usually translated in English as the apparatus. But the apparatus is not one piece of machinery. It refers to the whole about what brings together. I mean, they're both deconstructionists, which is the problem that needs to be addressed, but they're both in their deconstruction of the concept of man, claiming that there is a total worldview that comes with this technological and framing that brings together politics, sexuality, everything. And I thought that was interesting to mention in this regard, because that's also the starting point with which Guardini began, even though his response is totally the opposite of what they're saying. But what both Foucault and Agamben add, and I'm not going to go into conspiracy thinking or anything like that, is that the result is a mode of surveillance. And obviously Orwell in 1984 already had presaged that, but are we comfortable with the modes of surveillance that exist in the world today? And is that is that something that we need to think about in connection with these other dimensions of tech? I mean, we think of technology as a tool that you put down, but if you're being surveilled, this is their point. It's not just a tool to put down; it's something that envelops you. So that obviously can lead to all kinds of weird conspiracy theories, and that's not what I was advocating. But I thought that was an interesting take on the matter.
No, I agree. It was very interesting, but again, very difficult. Especially, I'm not very familiar with continental philosophy. This is something I'd like to be more familiar with as time goes on. And actually, I talked with Jeff Bishop about that yesterday too. About how can I, where should I go to read up on all this stuff? It seems to me then, contrasting Guardini and these two figures, Foucault and Agamben, we have on the one hand Christian hope versus secular pessimism or secular paganism. And there's something else I wanted to ask you about. Towards the end of that section, you indicate that both Foucault and Agamben's structures or their approaches to the same problem end up in various totalizations. Can you maybe elaborate on that? I'm not quite sure I understand what you're referring to.
It's a problem. So if you think about the sphere and the polyhedra, or you think about wholes and parts, is there a way of, if technology is not just one element but is something all-encompassing, how do you see outside of it? I mean, is there a metaphysical mode, thinking about even the ancient question about the one and the many, that enabling us to see from everywhere all at once? Well, from the Christian perspective, totalization can be an idolatry. I mean, you can be claiming to look at the world in a way that only God looks in the world. But if we go back to what I said earlier about 1 Corinthians 2:16, we're asked to take on the mind of Christ as our own, but we're just followers of Christ. We just have partial knowledge. We don't have the total knowledge of the God-man. So there's an interplay there between a view of the whole that is reserved for the God who creates out of nothing, that is uniquely God's, and the human perspective. Karl Barth, in his dialectical thinking, said that can't be superseded. We're just left with that dialectical contrast. We're sinners in the hands of an angry God in the end. I mean, that's not Barth's phrase, but mixing theologians here. But anyway, that kind of dialectical opposition, the Gegenüber, is a certain Barthian motif that would resolve it in that way. Whereas Guardini is not saying that we can see the world in the way that the Creator, God, sees the world. That's unique to God. But this notion of liturgical participation, this notion that in our desire to consume Christ, we're expressing, this goes back to Augustine, we're expressing a desire to be consumed by God in the reception of the Eucharist, in the consumption of the body of Christ, and that therein lies not just a partaking of God, which is already scriptural and biblical, but a being overtaken by the God who loves us and sees all things from the end of history. So the liturgical element, Guardini wrote his famous Spirit of the Liturgy, influenced by Odo Castle and the movement of Maria Lach. The liturgical element then becomes the key to unlocking the problem of technology.
Beautiful. If I may, are you sensing any audio issues? Sometimes when you speak, it sounds a little fuzzy on my earbuds. I don't know if that's on my end or if there's any indication on your end of a microphone problem or anything like that.
I just increased the volume.
Okay, that may help. All right, so as we move like toward the close of your paper, I want to ask how might this relate to our appropriation of media, like the media we're on right now. I spend a lot of time. In fact, again, I joked with Dr. Bishop yesterday about how is it that a guy who has a podcast and he blasts himself all over YouTube tells people to stay off the internet? It seems kind of silly. On the one hand, yeah, there's a motive. Like I want your wisdom to reach a broader audience. I've got some thoughts of my own that I think people might benefit from. But on the other hand, media theory, the ecology of media, if you will, these sort of things, they really do form us in ways that we're often unaware of. And so, I'm thinking like McLuhan, or again, back to Charles Taylor, how might Guardini's approach relate to their work? I don't know if you can offer some thoughts on that, and then perhaps what do you think is the path forward, right? And then we can conclude with that question on AI we spoke about.
So I feel caught myself. I'm participating in this webinar, also trying to raise fundamental questions about the metaphysical foundations of our approach to technology. Maybe that's a paradox. Maybe that's a contradiction. I switched to a flip phone, but family and friends cried bloody murder when I did that, saying I was, cutting myself off from my loved ones. So that didn't work. So I don't have I wish I had like practical pointers to say, this is all you do. You can obviously take, fast from your cell phone for a while and do all those things, but take retreats from it. And that's all for the good. But in terms of the intellectual component in your question, I've been going back to reading Marshall McLuhan, the Jesuit Walter Ong, Ivan Illich, Sister Mary Timothy Prokes, the Franciscan Sister of the Eucharist, her book At the Interface. I wrote a review of that. It's available online. Justin E.H. Smith, Anton Barbacay, A Web of Our Own Making. These are all kind of McLuhan-esque sources that I've been reading to think about our new digital age. So one of the questions that I want to ask in the book I'm writing about Guardini is his understanding in Letters from Lake Como and The End of the Modern World of technology sufficient, given that he's still grappling with the age of the machine, or do we have a new era of technology? Now, my colleague Michael Pensina helped me to see that there's 4 technological revolutions. So in the 18th and 19th century, you have the beginnings of the era of the machine, and then the late 19th, early 20th century, the era in which Guardini and Heidegger are working. It's really the height of industrial technology, railroads and the telegraph, and then eventually Alexander Graham Bell are revolutionizing the way that communications and commerce are done. Read about, the critiques of the meatpacking industry in Chicago in the early 20th century, and then the kind of social consequences of all that. And then in the late 20th century, what I experienced as a revolution, the digital computing. My father was a computer scientist. He went to MIT to test out his computer programs on punch cards when I was like a baby at my mother's lap. And like I grew up with computer punch cards. And then the fourth technological revolution, I think the World Economic Forum dubbed it that in 2016, is AI and artificial intelligence. And that has, like, in the last 8 or 9 years, literally taken off like wildfire. So how do we, I'll just pose it as a question, how do we make sense of these 4 technological revolutions when Guardini only really had one in mind? Have we gone way beyond his expectations? Have we entered this brave new world that was just way off in the future of 1984? And then what do we make? If so, what do we make of that?
Sure. Well, it seems to a large degree that, in fact, we have entered a brave new world of sorts. I can recall during COVID tide, during blessed COVID tide, where it seemed like the dystopian reality that was 1984 was not entirely accurate. And I don't mean to say that it was a strict prediction of sorts, but it seemed rather that Huxley's Brave New World was more like the future we had to look forward to, if that was going to be, kind of the way things unfolded. And I think, thankfully, it doesn't seem to be totally the case, but there are still some surprising similarities. Sterilization is civilization. And we've not to rehash the novel here, but like you mentioned, you try to put away your cell phone. You try to say, I don't really need a phone that computes better than NASA. Let me just have one that makes phone calls. And then, your children are like, wait a minute, but how will I send you a picture? How will you watch my Instagram reel? But Dad, you won't be able to follow me on Facebook. And you're thinking to yourself, probably, well, that's okay, because I know you in real life and we can have a conversation. But even somebody such as yourself, who's very aware of the problems and probably aware to some degree of, yeah, this is the solution, like breaking out of this paradigm once more. It's become so difficult. I'll even say almost impossible. If you truly wanted to get away from the technocratic paradigm, you would have to live as if you were Amish and basically start again. Maybe you could allow for some electricity, maybe some light bulbs in your house or something like that. But if you don't go to such extremes and you're constantly immersed, there's a camera, there's a computer, there's an audio interface, here's a microphone, all these light bulbs, these are on Wi-Fi. I can make them brighter or make them dimmer. The fact that we're speaking to each other in different time zones, hundreds of miles away, this is all these things form and inform us. And so in a lot of ways, I think it's too late. But then again, I want to take the approach that Guardini takes, and that Francis takes somewhat as well, that this isn't, it's not over. It's an incomplete thought. And we've got the light of Christ to guide us. We've got the church. We've got the Christian virtue of hope, and the knowledge that even in what seem to be the darkest of times, Christ can transform all of these things, and God can use them for a greater good. I try to keep in mind that even though it seems like this is the worst age we've ever lived in, maybe not. Maybe it's only the worst because I've only experienced one age. Perhaps the 800s would have been worse, relatively speaking, or maybe in 500 years from now it'll be that much worse. It's hard to say, and I don't mean to
The plague's
speculate.
under control.
Say again.
the plague at least is under control.
For now, yes. Waiting for our overlords to release another batch any moment. Let's move then to that fourth paradigm that you said involves AI. How in the world can we get our minds around something like this? And then you also mentioned off camera, or before we clicked record, that Pope Francis has some things to say about this also.
Right. So, and we recently did a public event on this issue of AI ethics at Duke, and in which I introduced the event by talking about the June 14th meeting of Pope Francis at the G7 summit. It was the first, the Italian Prime Minister Meloni had invited Pope Francis to speak to that august body. So you have to understand, Pope Francis got up and gave a short speech about AI ethics in front of the British Prime Minister, in front of Joe Biden, in front of Macron, in front of his own president, Milei, who had said really nasty things about him in his electoral campaign, was there. And he gave basically a short talk about the question of being and AI ethics. And he started by saying that AI is an exciting and fearsome tool. I mean, I don't know what the world leaders got in their, as they were listening to translators with their earbuds or whatever, but he used the phrase in Italian, un strumento affascinante e tremendo, meaning AI is not just any old tool, but it's one that's affascinante, that's wondrous. It could be the golden calf. It could be the face of God. We don't know. It's fearsome, tremendo. I mean, that's that sense that you had that God alone strikes fear in us. So he goes on to give more meat, put some meat on those bones, but he's basically saying, here we have something that can be, and at the end, he concludes by saying we need a healthy politics to deal with all that. Good luck. But like we need a discourse to help us to figure out how to bring this under control. Now, in our little AI summit we did at Duke shortly after that G7 address, Michael Pensina, as a fellow Catholic who works at Duke AI Health, made the point that 10 years ago he said that this is going to be hard to regulate. Now the Food and Drug Administration, which is in charge of the regulation of AI, comes to him and saying, by the way, we're no longer able to regulate it. Can you guys in the academy and industry come up with self-regulation? How's that going? So there are really, this is the optimistic side. There are really good people like my colleague Michael Pensina that have been working on this from whose field is data management, and have been working on this from the inside, trying to say, well, let's establish guidelines. Let's at least try to put the human person at the center of this project. So I think that's where we're at. Can we, and that's really the same question that Heidegger and Guardini are asking at the beginning of the 20th century. Can we put the genie back in the box, in the bottle? Can we now make sense of what this is doing to our concept of the human person? And can we put the dignity and sacredness of the human person at the center of our use of this instrument?
So it boils back down to man's freedom and what he chooses to do with it. Like that's the core of these questions. In that final section, again, the unfinished thought or the incomplete thought. Let's see. I want to read just page 202. Christian freedom is the answer to the unpagan paganism that Guardini finds at the end of the modern world. His account of that freedom sometimes relies on a heavily Neoplatonic understanding of the eye of the mind as a way to grasp the totality of the life world, but he is still grappling to find the right language to articulate this dynamic. So again, here's vision being an essential component, and the vision, we sort of skipped over this part. We can come back to it if you want. He takes a section from Romans 1 and explain or interprets it rather very philosophically as sort of the foundation of his vision. I think I lost my train of thought, but I think the reason I was drawn to this passage, I highlighted it, is because the fatalism that is present in Heidegger, Foucault, Agamben is overcome by the Christian view of the eschaton, the Christian understanding of freedom and hope. And yes, do you have thoughts on that? Because I forget where I was going with all that.
Well, Romans 1 is the beginning of the Christian theology of conscience, and how we're convicted by our knowledge and love of Christ, and at the same time called to look within, to make a discernment, to make a judgment about reality as a whole. When I presented that last section at the New Ressourcement conference, there was a little bit of pushback from a distinguished colleague and friend who thought that I was kind of embracing incompleteness as such. So I want to say like a word about that. I mean, how do we can't see the world the way that God sees it. You have to be the one who creates out of nothing to have such a vision. But incompleteness is not the last word at the same time. So if I can go back to the kind of Platonic Augustinian thinking that has so affected me, and use the phrase of Augustine that was picked up by Nicholas of Cusa, docta ignorantia, learned ignorance. In some ways, we have to unknow what we know even about God in order to come to grips with the love of Christ in all of its unfathomability and all of its depth and beauty. But we're still put on a path, and this is where, for Guardini and for me, liturgical praxis is the real path that we're seeking to follow, in the liturgical practice in the widest sense, not some magic formula that's going to enable us to make sense all of reality at once, but through the rhythms of a life of prayer and devotion to God, and submission to the order of the liturgy, and the love of God that can be experienced, and the invitation to participate in the kingdom of God that comes through the liturgy. I think of Schmemann here, that there's a way out of this impasse.
Indeed. So maybe as a final thought, I still couldn't recover what I was going for a moment ago. So forgive my unlearned ignorance if you don't mind. You say again on page 202, the postmodern path started by Heidegger rejected humanism as an authentic path because humanism, in Heidegger's view, still adheres to an ontotheological definition. In other words, like a given definition of human nature. Maybe that, and so then Guardini would disagree and say, no, there is an ontotheological dimension to human nature because we're not self-creating. We have received our being. All that aside, it seems like that might be a way to approach the question of AI, is for a more general, a deep and broad recognition of what man is and what he isn't. Because if we are just the proverbial ghost in the machine, or if I'm just a collection of molecules that has some really nifty skills with a keyboard, then let's make a better me. Let's upload it, and then you can do with me whatever you see fit. But if I'm unique, if you're unique, if my kids that don't understand what all this means, if they're unique, and there's a being about them that's more than just computing, that's more than just biological, then we can perhaps begin to tackle the question of AI a little more seriously, and root it once again in the notion of man's use of his own freedom, like the powers that we're bestowing upon ourselves. I don't know. What do you say to that?
So I think that's exactly right. Recently, a close friend wrote to me, and this friend sadly had lost her spouse, is in a grieving stage, and a well-meaning child mailed her Alexa. And so she would have some company. And I said, don't open the box. Call us when you're in need. Don't open the box. And I think she was grateful for that. So, I mean, we're coming up with all these facsimiles, right, to replace human interaction with artificial interaction. And all of it's well-meaning. All of it's well-intended. All of it's trying to help our sister and brother. But we don't realize the sea in which we're swimming, much less how to get out of it. So I think you're absolutely right. And then on the question of being in God, I would just recommend my colleague, Jenna Martin-Soskas. I just reviewed her Naming God. It's fabulous on this it's a very technical question about being in God and ontotheology. And she does an amazing job in naming God with that very difficult question. But yeah, the bottom line is that we need to see how artificial intelligence can be a tool, one that's an exciting and fearsome tool, but only to implement it or to actualize its potentialities for the sake of human interaction, for the sake of putting the human person at the center of our thinking, of our being, and our living. That's a tall order, but I don't see what the alternative is if humanity is going to seek human flourishing and survive.
Well, there you have it. I think that's a great place to end. Dr. Casarella, one of the questions I frequently ask my guests is, if people want to learn more about this, or if they just want to stay sort of up on developments in philosophy, theology, culture, and so on, do you have any recommended reading or places that people can go, whether they're technological or otherwise? For instance, I can recommend the new Ressourcement. I typically also recommend Communio as a journal. Do you want to plug anything or offer some suggestions?
No, those are my two plugs, so I'm happy with that.
I didn't mean to steal your thunder. Okay. How can people keep up with you and your work?
We have a new Catholic initiative we started at Duke Divinity called Fons Vitae. You can go to our website, get our newsletter, see what we're up to. That's one way to do it.
Excellent. Well, that music means that our time is running short. We want to remind all of you that if you go to canon211.locals.com, that you can access more content just like this, articles that I've written, other interviews that I've done, and there's more on the way. So take heart. The antidote to the technocratic paradigm, it's coming soon. That's all I have to say. Dr. Casarella, thanks again. This has been a real honor and enlightening. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for generously sharing your time with me this morning. So there we go, folks. As we always do, I want to remind you here at the Paleocrat Diaries to never give up, to keep on smiling, and to memento mori. Cheers.